XPO is the stereo prismatic oscillator. But what does that mean? A prism is something that breaks a beam of light into its elements, which we can see as colors, and points it in multiple new directions. A prismatic oscillator may be something that takes a simple sound and extracts different timbres from it and points it in multiple new directions. Shining light through the facets of the prism and turning it creates different combinations of colors. The XPO is a prism not for light, but for sound. Several facets of sound, frequency, timbre, and space are all intermingled in the lattice. One scientific idea of sound has musical notes being interpreted as a collection of partials. According to Fourier theory, any periodic sound can be interpreted as and recreated by a collection of sine waves at varying frequencies and amplitudes. When the frequencies are exact multiples of each other, which is the most common in musical tones, they're called harmonics. This theory provides a numerical way to describe tones being more bright, dull, pure, crunchy, etc. It implies a direct connection between frequency and timbre. However, for the math to work correctly, the sound must not just be periodic, but must also be infinite in duration, which is not something that occurs in nature, not even in machines. So like most concepts, this provides a useful framework for interpreting reality, but it does not perfectly describe reality. An analog oscillator, such as the XPO, tends to utilize circuits to generate shapes that can be interpreted and heard as different collections of harmonics. Let's take a listen. The core of the XPO is the triangle wave. This wave looks like the output voltage increasing and decreasing at the same speed, going up and down and creating a triangle. It sounds like this. The triangle contains some harmonics, namely every other harmonic, but in rapidly decreasing amplitude as we go up the harmonic series. So the fundamental sticks out more than the other harmonics, and it has a broad, clear, basic sound to it. All the other shapes on the XPO are created using the triangle as raw material. For example, the sine wave uses finely calibrated shaping circuits to bend the triangle into a rounder shape. A perfect sine wave, which does not and never will exist in nature, would be interpretable only as a single tone with no upper harmonics whatsoever. The analog sine wave is an approximation, but when we compare it to the triangle, we can hear that it does sound more clean and simple. The triangle wave sounds, I'd call it a little thicker or even fatter. It will cut through a little more. The sawtooth wave's output voltage increases and decreases at very different rates. It jumps to its maximum just about instantaneously and then decreases more slowly. This creates a big point at one end of each cycle. The theoretical sawtooth wave contains all harmonics right up to infinity, decreasing in amplitude as we go up, but not quite as rapidly as they do in the triangle wave. The result is a sound that sounds quite loud and rich, and to me almost sharp. Meaning sharp like a blade, not sharp as in pitch. The next wave on the XPO is the spike wave, where most of the cycle is flat, but there is one very thin moment of full amplitude right in the middle of each cycle. This wave tends to suppress the fundamental and the lower harmonics and let us hear the upper harmonics more clearly. To me, it sounds thin, scratchy, buzzy. The sub-output is made to emphasize the sub-harmonics. In other words, you'll hear partials that are lower frequency than the fundamental. So if we consider these 5 different waveforms as collections of harmonics, we have the sine wave with basically no harmonics, the triangle with some upper harmonics, the sawtooth with all harmonics, the spike with very little in the way of lower harmonics, and the sub with subharmonics. If the triangle core is a clear beam of sound, the prism of the XPO shatters it into these different components of the spectrum. In the history of analog synthesizers, we also find a number of ways to dynamically change the harmonic makeup of basic waves. The XPO gives us access to several of these methods, using the FM bus and the modulate and center parameters. Pulse width modulation changes the width of a square or pulse shape to shift back and forth between the even and odd harmonics of the sound. By the way, with the pulse width at 50%, we have the other classic analog waveform, the square, which theoretically should contain the same upper harmonics as the triangle, but at louder amplitude. Classically, this sound has been described as reedy. I personally think of the square wave as wide or broad. I'm not sure why exactly. To me, it also evokes classic video game music, much of which was made with pulse and square waves because they are computationally simple when created digitally. Another way to dynamically change the harmonic makeup of a wave is using a filter. Particularly sawtooth and square waves, which contain louder upper harmonics, can be carved into other shapes pretty dramatically by using a low-pass filter to remove upper harmonics as we see fit. Both pulse width modulation and low-pass filtering are very commonly found circuits on keyboard synthesizers from the 1970s all the way to today. The last two output sets on the XPO are inspired by classic circuits from modular synthesizers, specifically the Buchla 258 and 259. The very timbre uses the center parameter to do something similar to the 258, namely a smooth crossfade from a sine wave with theoretically no upper harmonics to a sawtooth with theoretically every upper harmonic. In some ways, we could consider this to be almost identical to running the existing sawtooth through a low-pass filter. As we continue to filter out harmonics, we will eventually be left with nothing except the fundamental. These two techniques result in pretty similar results at either end of the control range, but they're achieved with entirely different means. And then we have the wave folder. This circuit is inspired by the Buchla 259, and we can hear other versions of it on the Make Noise DPO and Zero Coast. This circuit adds amplitude to the sine wave until it maxes out and changes direction, folding over on itself and adding upper harmonics in a way that sounds pretty different from a sine to saw crossfade. Again, these dynamic harmonic motion techniques are performed with various methods in terms of circuitry, but a through line for all of them is that they're based on the idea of adding or subtracting harmonics. And none of them change the core frequency of the oscillator, so various combinations of them can be used simultaneously and stay in tune. Another way to add harmonics is through FM, or frequency modulation. Unlike the techniques we've talked about so far, this one does affect the core of the oscillator and will affect all outputs simultaneously. Also, unlike the other techniques, it can add frequencies that are not harmonically related to the core. Basically, if we patch a waveform from a different VCO into the FM input, then it will add partials in the form of sidebands whose frequencies are determined by the relationship between the two oscillators. oscillators are tuned to a harmonic relationship, we would get harmonics, but when they're not, the timbre becomes much more complex and can begin to lose its frequency identity entirely. And if we listen to all the various outputs, we'll hear that they're all affected in a similar way by this modulation. If we don't patch an external source to the FM input, then we find a version of the sub output will FM the oscillator instead. At low depths, this can create subharmonics that are always in tune with the oscillator core, and it will destabilize the core at higher depths. So to recap, we've looked at two facets of sound in the XPO, frequency and timbre. These two facets of sound are highly interrelated to the point where you could almost say they're different aspects of the same thing. Another facet to think about is the way that sound is encountered by humans in the world, namely through the ear and in space. Humans use their two ears to locate sound in a space. So when we play sounds through two speakers in a varying way, our ears can perceive movement or depth. Panning is the classic way to treat this. A simple change in relative loudness between the speakers creates a corresponding change in loudness between the two ears on our head, and we experience it as sounding like motion from left to right. This is an important element when mixing music, as panning various sound sources helps to support the illusion that several instruments are occupying a shared space. With modules like XPan, we can automate panning to make particular voices move around in the stereo field. In general, electronic music is not limited to the kind of realistic spaces that might be preferred for mixing in other styles. But it's also possible for extremes of panning to make a mix sound lopsided or gimmicky. So a question to ask is, how do we use the stereo field to create depth and space without calling attention to movement in a distracting or gimmicky way? One answer we've come up with in recent years is to make it easy to modulate left and right channels of a stereo process in varying degrees or directions with a single control source. For example, on QPOS we have the left and right radiate controls. As we can hear, when they're moved individually, they affect only their respective channel if the QPOS is being monitored in stereo. Furthermore, we can modulate them individually with the CV inputs. However, if we use only the left radiate CV input, then we can control both radiates at once using the same shape. If we set the knobs to the same spots on both sides, we get a modulation that sounds unified. Different amounts let us emphasize one side or the other while still being tied together. And opposite directions via the attenuverters give us a more aggressive stereo image, but one that is intimately connected on both sides to the shape of the modulator. Similarly, on the XPO's stereo outputs, the modulate left and right parameters can be used independently. Pulse width modulation, vary timbre, waveforms. But if we use only the modulate left CV input, just as on QPOS, we get modulation of both sides using the same shape, but in varying amounts and directions. On the pulse width modulation and wavefolding outputs, it's possible to create silence by hitting the extremes of the control. But in general, this is a modulation of timbre and frequency to create space, rather than a modulation of amplitude or volume as panning would be. This makes it so that two independent outputs, each with their own sound, begin to sound more like one unified space, with changes happening across the space that don't sound simply like movement through the space. Additionally, we have a parameter called center that operates the same on both sides of the vary timbre and wavefolding outputs. Modulating this parameter can help to tie the two sides together in this space, even if they're receiving pretty different modulation. Another way to anchor these frequencies and timbres within a space while they're in motion is to mix the waves that are being modulated with others that are not. The 5 mono waves at the top are great candidates for this. Here we can hear that even audio rate modulation of the timbre parameters not affect the core frequency of the module. So we can almost use the mono outputs as an anchor to reinforce the original set of harmonics among whatever else is happening in timbre and space. If we use the outputs of the XPO itself as modulators, then the result will be more naturally in tune than when using external sources. And of course, we can modulate the filters of the QPOS at audio rate as well, while maintaining this tune. Using a low-pass filter on a complex waveform can give us great dramatic sweeps while also darkening the sound. Modulating the filter frequency with the spike wave brings a little of the upper harmonics back into the mix, while still allowing for these sweeps. Other waves also make good in-tune modulators. Subharmonics with the sub output, for example. We haven't really even scratched the surface of this prism just yet. The XPO and QPOS can get knotted together in countless ways while staying in tune, or not staying in tune. And there's not time to go over all the possibilities here, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Happy patching.